Good evening. My name is Seth Cunin, and I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for the moment of Arts and Humanities, and have the pleasure of representing both the faculty and the university for this inaugural lecture. Whenever I do one of these inaugural lectures or an event like this, I usually say, how sorry I am to do it, because usually I have to do the little introduction and then rush out before the conference starts or before the lecture starts. Tonight, I can truly say that I'm also very sorry to be doing it, because it reminds me that I'll be leaving Durham in a couple weeks, and I won't be able to work with people like Ludmilla and all of our other fantastic colleagues who work in the university. And certainly Ludmilla is one of the new people that have come only in the last year, and already her dynamism and energy have said to me and shown me how much I regret actually leaving Durham, because it really is a fantastic place to be able to work with people like Ludmilla, as well as the many other people here tonight. I think one of the interesting things for me in looking at this audience, which is different than most of the inaugurals that I've been to, is that I haven't seen someone from science, but that may be because I don't know too many people from the science faculty. There probably are scientists here as well, but there's certainly, I saw an anthropologist, I saw some archaeologists, I saw people from every single department in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and no doubt many other departments are represented as well. And that represents, in a sense, the reach of Ludmilla's ideas, the reach of her energy, and the reach of what she brings to Durham. And in a sense, her broadness can be almost summed up in just the trajectory of her career, starting off in the natural sciences, to history of science, and finally to history of art, but well beyond, with connections with museums, with artists, with academics. Almost anything you mention, and Ludmilla will have a connection with it. Ludmilla came to us in connection with the recent set of appointments that we made in connection with key strategic areas for the university. And we were particularly excited for Ludmilla when we heard that she was interested in the post, because we had been developing under Stefano Krakalici a really fantastic center for visual culture. And we felt that it would be fantastic to bring in some other people who had interest in that area. And Ludmilla brought a fantastic depth of knowledge and a depth of connections that really added to the fantastic work that had already begun in that area. And I'm sure that with Ludmilla's contributions here, in connection with other colleagues, we will have really a fantastic new area that will really broaden out what Durham has to offer, both in the United Kingdom and internationally. Now, in looking at Ludmilla's bibliography and her CV, I could speak for 10, 20 minutes, maybe even more, just on her career. But I think what I'll do is just touch on one thing. If you look at the website in connection with her recent book, The Look of the Past, and just look at what the book reviews say about that book, I think it sums up beautifully what Ludmilla has to offer and what we will be hearing tonight in a few minutes. I'll just read a few sentences from them. Few scholars can match Jordanova's ability to further historical practice through precise analysis, originality, and thought-provoking questions. And then it goes on to talk about the fantastic publication, but it highlights her key qualities: originality, challenging and thought-provoking, and precise as well. You rarely get those three things together. A second review said, a master historian of visual culture, bringing the subject to life, showing its importance to the understanding of any period of history. And finally, a staunchly argued, exceptionally lucid demonstration of the Enlightenment, and also a pleasure to be derived from alert, informed, inquiring look at the myriad artifacts surrounding us. I think those three book reviews really sum up the qualities that Ludmilla brings to this university and has brought to her career as a whole, and her many other publications. I'm sure that tonight's lecture will be a fine example of those qualities, and will be just one step in a further career in Durham, bringing fantastic new ideas to us and helping all of us to have the same kinds of qualities, well, not me, but you, that she has shown in her academic career and brings with her. So can I now welcome Ludmilla Jordanova to speak to us for her inaugural lecture.
I'd like to obviously to thank Seth for his exceedingly generous introduction, and I hope I can live up to some of the things that he's mentioned. And in saying thank you to him, I could remind you that gifts and thankfulness are closely related ideas, and I'll be returning to this at the end of the lecture. Now, before I begin, I need to give you a small health warning, or rather I need to give a small health warning for people who may view this online later on. So since this lecture is being filmed, I need to point out to viewers that the pictures I will be showing are in copyright and hence not included in the film. What I'm going to try and do is to give enough information in what follows to enable those images in the public domain to be found on the internet. And this will be principally on the National Portrait Gallery London, the Scottish Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh, and Tate websites. Some of the works I discuss are, however, in private collections, but reproduced in books about my two main protagonists. So I'm going to try, if you don't find it too annoying, to kind of give those kinds of clues as we go along. So let me begin. I hope I've got this the right way round. Okay, I am a little concerned that it's going to be difficult to see, but I mean, is that okay? Okay. So this man has just received the gift of life. He was given a liver transplant shortly before producing this searing self-portrait, one of an extensive series of artworks that records his recuperation from major surgery. The image, watercolor and black chalk on paper, was made on the 12th of May 1988 by John Bellany, the Scottish artist who died earlier this year, aged 71, 25 years after undergoing a successful operation in Addenbrooke's Hospital, Cambridge. Bellany produced numerous drawings and portraits and then prints at this time, starting as soon as he was able to hold a pen. And here I'm showing you other works in the series to provide a sense of the visual modes that he deploys. Bellany's drive to paint and draw was considered remarkable by the staff who cared for him, leading them to suggest that his artistic activity acted as an analgesic. The phrase gift of life comes up repeatedly in relation to Professor Sir Roy Cullen, born in 1930, and one of the surgeons who was performing liver transplants in Addenbrooke's at this time. Carl and Bellany became friends, and as we shall see, they painted each other. Carl has been interested in art and has painted since childhood, and I'm showing you here one of his self-portraits. Now, I became intrigued when I discovered this by the phrase gift of life, and this evening I'd like to pursue some of its implications and complexities, weaving together visual and written evidence. So gifts figure in this lecture as a device for thinking about the Bellany-Kahn case study, and then moving into the genre of portraiture, historical practice, and academic life. Now, these are big issues, and so I can only be suggestive rather than exhaustive. One attraction of gifts as such a framing device is that the plethora of accounts and representations in many genres over a long period of time means that by the 1980s, it had gathered layer upon layer of association and resonance that both Bellany and Kahn were able to exploit. There is, in other words, a deep, dense history here. Now, it may be appropriate before diving into Bellany and Kahn, their friendship and artworks, as what we might call a case history, to explain how I came to be thinking about these materials in the first place. So since the early 1990s, I've been working on portraits produced from the 17th century onwards, And in a sense, I've been experimenting with what a historian interested in visual culture could do with them. It is clear that in times and places where portrait making is an embedded practice, it is central to the construction and mediation of identity. Now, I do not take identity to be a straightforward notion, but it is an exceedingly useful term for gathering together the kinds of significance that people, and I would stress not only elites, find in portraits. The ways in which representations of people, designed to be in some way recognizable, touch those who see them, often profoundly. Furthermore, portraiture is intricately bound up with practices of giving and receiving gifts. It is commonly understood that in giving a portrait of themselves, donors offer and recipients accept an intangible part of the sitter along with the likeness. The point applies even where there are intermediaries and institutions involved. Since 2009, I've been working on a medical humanities project funded by the Wellcome Trust. And my contribution to this multi-stranded project is called Case Studies of Medical Portraiture. And the idea was that it should be wide-ranging with respect to both period and the types of portrait we considered. Now, I have been particularly concerned to put constant pressure on the very notion medical. And I've also been long interested in doing longue durée work, which, while it needs no defense in historical circles, invites careful articulation on each occasion, as indeed does research on materials that are more or less contemporary. I would like to touch lightly on these methodological points as we go along, so I could describe the approach I am taking here in terms of grounded theory, that is, keeping frameworks and materials in constant conversation with one another. I would now like to return to the gift of life that John Bellamy received in Cambridge in 1988. And that language, as I've implied, is Cahn's rather than Bellamy's, although Bellamy accepted that he had received something rather special. So here is his portrait of Cahn, undertaken shortly after the operation, and not, so far as I am aware, in a public collection. At the top left-hand side of the picture, I'm afraid I don't think you can see this, but please take my word for it. At the top left-hand side of the picture, Bellamy has written this: "For Professor Sir Roy Cahn, the man who gave me the elixir of life." That language is Cahn's rather than Bellamy's, although Bellamy accepted, as I said, that he had received something special. So this is his portrait of Cahn, undertaken shortly after the operation, and not, so far as I'm aware, in a public collection. On the top left-hand side of the picture, Bellamy has written, "For Professor Sir Roy Cahn, the man who gave me the elixir of life." And what I'm saying is that I want to explore this phrase a bit. Now, it is especially intriguing that Bellamy put the last part, "the man who gave me the elixir of life," in quotation marks, but I have not been able to discover whether it is a quotation from a particular source. Now, of course, the notion of an elixir of life is extraordinarily widespread, both chronologically and geographically, with deep roots in alchemy and medicine, and taken up by writers, poets, filmmakers, for example, in the 1992 film Death Becomes Her. It is bound up with speculations about human beings living forever and dreams of a fountain of youth. It is hardly surprising that Bellamy, through his roots in austere Scottish Calvinism, his training as a painter, and his insistent use of symbolism and allegory in his work, should invoke a phrase, and I think without irony, with such rich resonances. And to give you a sense of his allegorical and symbolic interest, I am showing you allegory, which it's very difficult to see, but this is a kind of crucifixion scene, but with fishes rather than human bodies, from 1964, which is in the Scottish Gallery of Modern Art. And here you see one panel from it, which perhaps gives you a better, a more vivid sense of its qualities. And I'm also showing you here a picture which he calls Pourquoi, painted in 1967 after his visit to East Germany, which included a visit to the Buchenwald concentration camp. However, it is surprising that he evoked the elixir of life in this context, a transplant that involved radical surgery, not a drink, and an operation that was not, it turns out, actually performed by Calne himself. And in order to keep a sense of the reciprocity of their relationship alive, I'm showing you Calne's 1988 painting, John Bellamy Convalescence, and then, to turn it round, a drawing of Calne by Bellamy shortly after his operation. Now, in order to take this a little bit further, I want to show you another picture. So this is a portrait of Calne by Bellamy, commissioned by the National Portrait Gallery in 1992. This watercolor diptych, which measures 30 by 44.5 inches, shows Calne twice, with Bellamy prone on the left-hand side, actually receiving a new liver from Calne. Now, like Bellamy's other work for the gallery, his portraits of the archaeologist Colin Renfrew and of the cricketer Ian Botham, sorry, I should have said the Colin Renfrew is 1992, the same year as the portrait of Roy Calne, and the Botham was much earlier, 1985. These pictures were all accepted by trustees, but failed to win enthusiasm either from them or from the public. And it is therefore particularly striking, this is a newspaper article that was published in 1999, that Calne stated that he had not performed the operation on Bellamy. And I think it's very interesting that he didn't say who did. But all the publications on this suite of works state with complete confidence that it was indeed Calne who performed the operation. And I think they assume this because of this body of artwork that followed from it, and which is, as I've hinted, very, very extensive. Now, we could say that Bellamy participates, if idiosyncratically, in the broad language of gifts by referring to the elixir of life, and we could then move on. But I think that will be rather unsatisfying, and I think it will perhaps even be a little dishonest, since it's impossible not to notice that the notion of an elixir of life is usually handled with considerable ambivalence. Think, for example, of Nathaniel Hawthorne's short story, Dr. Heidegger's Experiment, of 1837, where drinking from the fountain of youth by the doctor's elderly and decrepit friends, he does not, we note, participate himself, is shown as vacuous and vain, even childish. Such a quest for lost youth through effervescent water certainly does not bring blessings, and Bellamy, with his interest in myth, could hardly have been unaware of the deep, dense history of the elixir of life and of the profoundly mixed feelings with which it was associated. Gifts, we know, have to be handled with care, and this applies whether they are material objects or special qualities that human beings possess. I want to suggest that the most significant implication of Bellamy's inscription is that he was made healthy by a kind of magic. And indeed, magic has many sides that are darker or lighter according to one's point of view, the magician's intent, and the context in which it is deployed. The elixir of life is shrouded in secrecy and arcane knowledge. So however much Bellamy fated the man who did not personally enable him to live another quarter of a century, in apparently giving thanks for the gift of life, he had recourse to a metaphor that suggests not the skills and knowledge of medical science and surgical technique, but something esoteric that evades ordinary human comprehension. Now, before I continue with this case study, I'm going to step back for a tiny moment and draw out a couple of implications of what I have said so far. First, the task of understanding the materials I have mentioned from the 1980s and 1990s cannot be anything other than profoundly historical. It is essential to be able to speak about layer upon layer of references and associations, how these change color and texture, fade in and out of focus, and how they are put to work in the face of fresh situations such as organ transplantation. Ideas of gifts and elixirs with their magical tinge and mixed emotional connotations are still doing significant jobs in the contemporary world. And they may actually be capable of helping us understand the post-war as well as other worlds, and perhaps especially the dramatic changes in medicine that it has seen, which are often discussed in terms of miracles. Now, this brings me to the second implication. These ideas, gift, elixir, are non-mechanistic, even anti-reductive. They hold the complexities of what human beings do while acknowledging the difficulties we have in fully explaining them. In ordinary speech, when we say something, a scene or an experience, for example, is magical, we grant and respect those difficulties. Now, I'm interested in this point because I think it neatly encapsulates some of the challenges of historical practice. I am not, of course, saying that historians can describe what is difficult to explain or understand in these terms, but that the quest about which practitioners of history inevitably have diverse views, but nonetheless our quest to grasp the complexities of human actions, thoughts and feelings in the past is in some sense a parallel one. Talk of heroes and villains, about evil, megalomania and so on, which is actually more common than we might like to admit, consists of just such holding terms. And in order to take this thought further, I now return to Roy Cullen. So here we have his self-portrait again. So the idiom of gifts and the phrase gift of life come up repeatedly in Cullen's own writings and in those about him. For example, in 1970, he published A Gift of Life, Observations on Organ Transplantation. This was just 2 years after he performed the first liver transplant in Europe. In 1991, there was an exhibition of his paintings called The Gift of Life, with an accompanying publication, including an appreciation by John Bellany. And actually a number of the images I'm showing you are from that book. In 1998, The Ultimate Gift, the story of Britain's premier transplant surgeon, was published. While in 1999, a small illustrated book appeared, produced by his colleagues and patients, that's what you see here, called A Special Gift, an appreciation of Sir Roy Cullen, quote, to celebrate a lifetime in transplantation. So I'm suggesting that we can use such a dense cluster to think about the ways we understand gifts more generally, both in our works and in our lives. Now, most books that deploy the phrase gift of life concern religion and spirituality. Others are medical in the broadest sense and discuss either organ transplantation or death. And this reinforces my already strong conviction about the importance of keeping religion and medicine in play together, no matter what the period. Their intricate intertwinings, even in apparently secular, in quotation marks, societies, invite, I think, the most sophisticated historical analysis we're capable of generating. And I say this as someone who, at a personal level, has a thoroughly secular view of the world. While the historian in me is repeatedly struck at how present religious elements are in both portraiture and medicine. And the notion of the gift of life, or the gift of life, is simply one example. And another is the treatment of portraits as relics. The distinctive ways in which visual materials exemplify these themes are of particular interest to me, and I would like to suggest, actually more broadly, of particular importance. And I thought you might be interested to see this, which is actually, this is part of a diptych by Roy Cullen, and it's a homage not just to Mantegna, but to the patron saints of surgery, Cosmas and Damien. And so far as I know, Cullen also has a very secular orientation to the world. So I think it's very interesting that in exploring the kinds of practices he undertakes, he turns into this very, very overtly religious idiom. And this is the other side of the diptych, which shows a transplant operation actually in progress. What I'm going to do now is to offer you one possible take on the gift of life theme in the context of Cullen's work on liver transplantation. So it is undeniable that Bellamy, like other patients who received transplants at this time, would have died without a new liver. As the leader of a surgical team, Cullen might be said to bestow life on his patients, or rather on some of his patients, although he did not do so alone. And this is also from the same book by Patients and Colleagues. This image of one of his colleagues was for him a way of giving visual expression to the quality of care, the compassion that she gave her patients. His project here was to make tenderness visible. Sometimes he painted his patients, thereby endowing them with another kind of life, one more enduring than the transplant itself, as we see in this case. This boy subsequently died, and a copy of his portrait was made for his parents. It was Cullen's belief that he established another, easier kind of relationship with patients, especially young ones. Here's another young one, when he got out his artist's materials. And here we see him in a photograph painting one of his patients. But there is a strategic fiction in the phrase gift of life, which veils the death of another human being in order for the organ to be available, the grief of those they leave behind, and the very significant risks of failure. Cullen sometimes operated on the same patient a number of times, for example. And this is one of them. And this is actually a woman he knew as a nurse. And in the end, he gave her she received 4 liver transplants. So the warm feeling that the phrase gift of life is intended to generate should, I'm implying, be followed by reactions that are skeptical, nuanced, and questioning. Now, it seems to me that these thoughts lead in many directions, but I'm just going to mention 2. And the first concerns the role of visual culture in relation to gifts. The second is the nature of metaphor, which is a subject that perhaps historians don't talk enough about. Historical accounts, in fact, rely extremely heavily on metaphor, and our metaphors carry their own complexities and entailments as they are put to work in interpreting deposits from the past that are themselves already metaphorically dense. Now, of course, there's not time today to do justice to both these themes, but I'm keen to assert that metaphors matter, not just as central parts of scholarly analysis, but in our shared lives in universities and as citizens. And I'm going to come back to this thought at the end of the lecture. So here, let me just say that metaphors become especially significant when we are moving, as here, between visual culture and other forms and media. So these translations and transpositions are important phenomena, and for me it follows that we historians, I guess all of us, do well to pay attention to materials and cases where such shifts can be charted and probed. In one way, it should not matter to which category or genre a given source has been assigned. And it is not that we use such categories in the same way, quite the contrary, in fact. But it seems perverse to include what we might think of as rich historical deposits, because they allegedly belong to some category, such as music or poetry, that is allegedly owned by another field. So the category matters only insofar as it requires analysis that is sensitive to medium and genre. So I feel completely confident that, to take an example that I have mentioned tonight and discussed in my published work, that Nathaniel Hawthorne is an important writer for the work I do. And one reason for this is that a significant portion of his work addresses precisely the issues that I am raising tonight. He was, for example, intensely interested in art making, in the appearances of people, and in the potency of visual representations such as portraits. And when in the mid-19th century he turned such issues into novels and stories, a significant number of which we should note were set in earlier times, he was grappling with ways of expressing in words the power of gifts, the agency of pictures and scenes, the moral ambiguities of scientific and medical knowledge and intervention. And furthermore, when doing so, I'm suggesting he was himself historically aware. Now, while it will be perfectly possible to say that Hawthorne's preoccupations are best understood in terms of, quote, Gothic literature, that in no way diminishes his interest for me as a historian. And it is striking how persistent the magical motifs he deploys have been, including in critiques of modern science and medicine. He provides insights, in other words, into some of the layers of association that I mentioned earlier. And notions of an elixir of life or fountain of youth are not dead, indeed quite the opposite. They are alive and well and highly commodified in our own times, for example, in anti-aging products and in cosmetic procedures such as Botox. Now, I could recast much of what I have said so far in the language of witnessing. And I suggest this because I cannot think of a better one. So to return once again to Bellamy, whom you see here in a photograph a couple of years before he died, and here in another part of the Addenbrooke's Hospital series. So to return once again to Bellamy, he bore witness to his medical experiences in the ways he knew best, that is, by painting, here as etching and drawing, using his visual intelligence and manual skills. The results are highly mediated, and it is precisely those mediations that are so revealing. Despite Michael Baxendall's claim at the end of Painting an Experience in 15th Century Italy, which was first published in 1972, where he said, approached in the proper way, that is, for the sake of the argument, pictures become documents as valid as any charter or parish roll, the language of documents is, I think, potentially misleading in history circles. Baxendall's methodology is impeccable and inspirational. But if pictures are documents, those who make them are documenters. And that, especially since the advent of documentary photography and film, carries particular connotations. I prefer to see them as witnesses. Since artifacts are neither transparent nor disconnected from the worlds in which they are made and used, casting makers as special kind of witnesses recognizes the distinctive, historically revealing transformations that they undertake. It is time to return again to gifts. And I hope that at this point it is not too late to acknowledge the long and intricate history of scholarly interest in the gift, and not just in anthropology. And we see this, for example, in Harry Lieberson's 2011 book, The Return of the Gift, European History of a Global Idea, which I interpret as an exercise in intellectual history. And I wanted to signal that my interest is rather different. It's really not in gifts as an intellectual problem, but rather in gifts as metaphors and entities, and especially those connected with life and death, and with all of this in terms of cultural forms. Of course, this necessarily includes ideas, but it cannot be only or principally that. It must be images and objects too. And likewise, theories of the gift, as much of fundamental importance though these are not my main concern here. And I have to confess that I am particularly intrigued by the dark side of gifts, by Bellamy's blacked out face, the dead donor, which you saw the accident happening in the first part of Cullen's triptych. The terrible price that is exacted for some gifts. And I want to think about what I have presented as the very irreducibility of the concept of gift, which is a quality I think it shares with love. And naturally, of course, I take the claims of Marcel Mauss and many others about reciprocal gift exchange very seriously. But I think the continuing appeal of the language of gifts, whether verbal or visual, for example, in relation to transplants, may invite us to try and develop a somewhat different approach. Now, I hope it doesn't seem too strange to you if at this point I explore what I'm saying for a moment through really a rather different kind of source, namely fairy tales, so many of which feature the dark side of gifts and the irreducibility of gifts. Now, I have lost count of the number of times I have listened with my little granddaughter to a recent recording of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, read by Tamsin Greig. And this rendition is revealing, I think, very revealing on the question of gifts. Many versions of the story have come into being since it was first published in the 1830s, when Hans Christian Andersen wrote it, and you see a portrait of him from the 1830s. It gradually dawned on me that this recent, simplified and romanticized version contains a particularly striking take on gifts. In the adaptation by Anita Loughery, who writes children's books and materials for primary schools, the little mermaid, who is smitten by the handsome prince she has saved from drowning after a shipwreck, goes to the house of the wicked enchantress, where she is given a rainbow-colored potion that will give her legs in the place of a tail. In return, she gives the enchantress her beautiful voice. But for there to be a happy resolution, the little mermaid needs to get her voice back, which her sisters manage to do for her. And to marry the prince, to whom she has, of course, given the gift of life, and to live with him on dry land, she precisely needs the gift of the enchantress, which on this account is ultimately benign. Indeed, this gift from the enchantress rather glibly serves the cause of true love, despite the enchantress's predictions. This is not then, in the end, a form of reciprocal gift exchange. Within the logic of the retold story, the rainbow liquid possesses palpable magical powers. It is indeed an elixir. In the original version, Andersen, obviously when I say original I mean a translation of the original, Andersen calls it a bright, potent draught, bitter and fiery, which despite having blood in it is, quote, clear as the purest water. In the retold version, the liquid is multicolored. Now, however nasty the enchantress is, and I have to tell you, Tamsin Greig does a wonderful nasty enchantress, from the Little Mermaid's point of view, it is precisely a gift of life that enables her to join the man she loves on dry land. Furthermore, the enchantress genuinely has special skills, which enable her to bring about this miraculous and irreversible change, skills that in Loughery's version are indeed efficacious. Now, it goes without saying that the original is considerably more brutal. Hans Christian Andersen has The Little Mermaid give the witch her tongue, finds using her legs excruciatingly painful, and does not, I'm sorry to tell you, get her man. Now, despite the evident differences, I think the comparison with Roy Calne and John Bellamy is worth at least a moment's thought. Although I am not suggesting that Calne is quite like the Enchantress, quite is an important word there, he is, imaginatively speaking, the dispenser of elixirs and gifts, which somehow, sort of magically, gave Bellamy the chance to live and do what he loved for another quarter of a century. Such ideas around gifts continue to do powerful work in our own times and to have multiple resonances with visual and material culture. Of course, the ways Bellamy responded to his experiences were most unusual, yet he did so using tools and ideas that were widely available, and I think his case is good to think with. Now, shortly after the transplant, Bellamy painted himself as Prometheus. Sorry, this was the, here we go. So this is a suite, and I'm going to show you two, and they are, I think, extraordinarily savage. And Prometheus, we remember, was punished for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humankind, and this consisted of having an eagle peck out his liver, and since the liver grew back each night, this is a form of perpetual torment. Bellamy was also interested in the return to life of Lazarus, an interest that found expression in his artistic work before the transplant, but after he was seriously ill. So the point I'm making here is that Bellamy is using a whole range of cultural resources to explore his experience of being a transplant patient. Now, furthermore, the two aspects of gifts that I've been exploring just now, their magical dimensions and their double or maybe multi-sidedness, are so widely present in stories and in depictions of stories that far from being uninteresting to historians, they offer rich possibilities and opportunities for thinking about many kinds of continuity and change. Now, I'd like to pick up a thread mentioned a few minutes ago concerning visual culture and portraiture in particular. And the ways in which portraits are used as gifts have already been mentioned. And there is, for example, some wonderful work on miniatures, which are generally of a loved one, being worn close to the body, and then sometimes included in portraits of the wearer. The many exchanges and representations of portrait gifts between Queen Victoria and Prince Albert is a very good example, and one of my research students is working on that. There are myriad opportunities here for further work on gifts of life and love. But there is another way of drawing out this thread by considering the very making of a portrait as bestowing the gift of life, perhaps even the gift of eternal youth in some cases. And here I am not going to turn to Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, and first published in a magazine in 1890, tempting though that might be, because the point I actually want to make is a general point. Portrait painters juggle, if you like, past, present, and future when they paint. To bestow the gift of life, some people at any rate have to agree that any given portrait evokes the sitter in question, an evocation that can take many forms. And can I just remind you of the wonderful portrait of Virginia Woolf by her sister Vanessa Bell, which is very, very pared down, but gives an extraordinarily strong sense of the way in which Virginia Woolf carried her body. I think is it's not just about shape. I think it's about posture and pose. So this evocation can take many forms, and it absolutely does not depend on a reductionist type of verisimilitude. The very making of a portrait implies that, at least in principle, the resulting representation could outlive the sitter. And I suspect that many portrait painters are future-directed, even as they are aware of the burden of past precedents weighing on their shoulders. As I've already said, the belief that a portrait can stand in for the absent sitter is widespread and of long standing. Thus, those who produce portraits bestow the gift of life. Inevitably, gifts are not always well received. There is, for instance, the famous case of Graham Sutherland's depiction of Winston Churchill, which was destroyed. And what you're seeing now is one of the several preparatory sketches that are in the National Portrait Gallery, London. This is from 1954. So why would, according to the story, Churchill's wife have bothered to destroy this unless the portrait possessed some kind of unwelcome, quote, life? Now, in the last part of my lecture, I'm going to do something rather different, and I'm going to try and speak in a different register. As some of you know, this is not the first inaugural I have given, but it is certainly the last. I want to draw out what I see as some of the broader implications of my comments, at least, and I want to avow that this is extremely personal, and that these particularly concern teaching and the nature of scholarly and historical practice. Now, I want to avow to you that I find John Bellany's work deeply unsettling. And it's for that very reason that I think it's good to think with, however distressing we may find. In fact, I've, as you might imagine, given quite a few talks on these subjects, and until relatively recent, I haven't actually shown these pictures because I found it difficult to imagine speaking to an audience about pictures that are for me as raw as this. Now, these resulting processes of thinking with material like this are obviously aided and abetted by reaching for their contexts and working towards thick descriptions of relationships, settings, and artifacts. So this is nothing to do with whether I like his work or not, and it's also nothing to do with any claim about his quality as a painter. But it's rather to do with what I mentioned a few moments ago, his capacity to bear witness in ways that are thought-provoking for us. It is also about the ways in which, to put it rather simply, images, stories, myths, experiences, practice, and so on, move between media and across times. Contemporary materials contain such journeys in an accessible form, giving access to what I have called deep histories. And when they take visual form, paintings, drawings, prints, and photographs, for example, particular patterns emerge, especially in the case I have been considering, in relation to the human figure, hence the attention that I have paid to portraiture, the genre which promises engagement with specific nameable people. And I guess what I'm saying here is that portraiture only works because we can bring an embodied experience to a representation that is also, in a different sense, embodied. So both Bellany and Kahn, I want to suggest, manifest a kind of embodied understanding in their work. And this much, I think, is clear in the depiction of the intensive care nurse and the self-portrait with which I began. And forgive me if I'm labouring the point, but one of the things that I think is so interesting about this portrait is that the area of pain for him is clearly not the area where the operation took place. And what I've also been emphasizing is the theme about how human beings give more or less satisfying accounts of each other, accounts that are not mechanistic or reductive. Now, as a historian, I find this theme everywhere in my work, and I'm not, of course, suggesting that it is exclusive to history, only that this is the setting in which I myself encounter it. And in my writings on history and practice, I try to give accessible accounts of it. Now, these accounts, and indeed these practices, are bound to have interdisciplinary qualities, and I find it a particular pleasure to think about such issues with people with diverse formations, whether these include visual culture or not. Now, it has perhaps become banal to insist that scholars are always working on with and for the present, no matter what their ostensible field of study. Nonetheless, such self-awareness does no harm, and I think it has the potential to do a great deal of good. So how might the theme of gifts, however multi-sided, play out in our lives in universities? And I would like to suggest that one place in which they may play out is in teaching, where the capacity to nurture and be nurtured, and I think I want to have this up because that's what this is about, where the capacity to nurture and be nurtured might indeed be thought of in terms of gifts. And perhaps their dark side too, since the undermining of confidence and self-worth when it happens in an academic setting can be a legacy that endures forever. And I thought I should tell you, when I was at school, one of my teachers told me that I'd never get a place at university, and I do sometimes remember this with interest. Now, she was called Miss Brown, for the record, and she's no longer with us. And I saw a picture of her recently, and it's very interesting. It immediately brought back to me some of the discussions that we had, and this was more years ago than I would care to confess. And I want to suggest that these points that I've been trying to develop do not just apply to teaching, but to collegial relationships. And I think we partly turn to idioms such as gifts in order to resist, and rightly so, trends that are seen as somehow diminishing. Sorry, I think that's because I've been, sorry. I have been concerned with gifts that seem in some sense resistant, where however mechanical the procedures for endowing them, where however mechanical the procedures for endowing them, that is, surgery, however mechanical these procedures seem to be, there is something else that must be spoken about, for which people need languages that hold the complexities I have been trying, however fleetingly and briefly this evening, I've been trying to evoke. Now, universities may be rather different from hospitals that perform life-saving operations, but they may also possess some similarities that are worth noting. And I'm suggesting that forms of thankfulness may bring these similarities out, but that in any event, developing resistant languages that refuse to instrumentalize human relationships seems to be a vital project at this specific moment in the academic world. And I am not at all unwilling, myself, to say that in creative teaching and scholarship, there is indeed a kind of magic. Now, I'm not going to end there because I want to acknowledge the ways in which I feel that being here makes me the recipient of a special kind of gift for which I am truly grateful. So in order to conclude these thoughts and to come back to the theme of thankfulness, I want to remind you one more time about Roy Kahn's painting that sought to give visual expression to the quality of care that the intensive care sister gave her patients, which he cast in terms of compassion. Now, I acknowledge here that there is a world of difference between saying that someone is a compassionate nurse and representing the physical stance and expression that convey this to viewers. Opinions will certainly differ on whether Kahn has succeeded in doing this, but his concern with an abstract quality on the one hand, that is compassion, and a specific setting and situation and setting on the other, that is the intensive care ward at Addenbrooke's, are, I think, interesting. Kahn sought to embody care in the paint, in the composition, and in the details of the representation. Both the picture and the language are doing the holding work I spoke of earlier, and without which I would suggest we cannot do our jobs, and above all our teaching, which needs to be thought about and represented in non-mechanistic, anti-reductive idioms similar to those Kahn invokes for her. So I suppose one question I'd like to put to you is there an equivalent to this image for the kind of work that we do? This woman is bestowing a gift upon the patient, and Kahn is registering for that gift a form of thankfulness. So I'm suggesting that the theme of gifts has a natural connection with the notion of thanks. Now, of course, conventions around saying thank you are strong but highly complex in our society. For example, when stepping off a bus, it is common to thank the driver. But you could say that, like the nurse, he is only doing his job, and infer from that that thanks are inappropriate. But actually, this is a limited argument, as is evident if we reflect on why students thank those who teach them. After all, if we are privileged enough to hold a university position, we too are only doing our job. And yet, here I know I speak for many colleagues, when students give us thanks, especially in writing, it means a very great deal. And individual students with whom we have had a special type of contact, for example, through difficult personal times, stay in the mind for decades. We receive pleasure and satisfaction from having helped. So on one account, there is indeed a clear exchange. We give time, attention, and expertise, and in return, we gain fulfillment. Now, this is not a wrong account, but it is, as I've been trying to imply, it is a limited account. So what I'm suggesting is, should we think about what we do in terms of gifts? What gifts might teaching bestow upon the taught and indeed upon the teacher? Now, over more than 40 years of teaching in universities, I have come to believe that there is in fact a relatively simple answer to this question, which is simply that to engage openly with another person, to communicate to them a sense of belief in their abilities, to give constructive and supportive feedback, and to instill confidence. I think for me that is the most important bit of this. These lie at the heart of teaching and of colleagueship. So why might it be appropriate to see these as gifts? Perhaps because these qualities cannot be reduced to teaching technique or subject knowledge. Those are what are simply the basics of doing our jobs. And when these gifts have been received, recipients wish to give thanks, as John Bellany did to Roy Calne in describing him as the man who gave him the elixir of life, even though, as we noticed earlier, it wasn't Calne, it wasn't an elixir. So nonetheless, Bellany was thankful in some way, and I think his representations and his repeated representations of Calne carry within them their friendship. Now, while I want to end on what is a positive note, honesty compels me to admit that the values that I've just now articulated are not universally held in universities. And indeed, a very recent report suggested that British students are shortchanged because we, a lot of us are their teachers, are preoccupied with research and as a result neglect them. Now, this is not my experience, I have to say, and it is certainly not my experience in Durham. But even here, when I did my duo training, it was explained to me that I could set up the system so that students expected and received answers to their queries only once a week. Now, while I can see that this may be convenient, such an arrangement seems to me to violate a kind of tacit pact. Such a pact has not come about because students pay more, but because it helps them to learn, to grow, to develop more effectively when academic work is not mechanized or industrialized. And we too grow in the process in ways that resist any simple formula. So this theme, which could perhaps be expressed as anti-reductionism, has run throughout this lecture. It is something I feel very strongly about and have felt very strongly about for a long time, including from when I was a student of the biological sciences and then as a historian of science and medicine. And it too finds clear historiographical expression in a resistance to excessive reliance on self-interest as an explanatory device. Now, I am not denying the existence of egotism, narcissism, megalomania, and so on in human societies, but historical accounts that rely heavily, whether implicitly or explicitly, on such notions will always be partial. And indeed, I think there is an ethical principle at stake here. is it defensible to explain human beings in the past in ways we would not be willing to apply or have applied to ourselves? I would say that it is not, and that one of the main purposes of the humanities and social sciences is to ensure that their explanations are as rich and warmly human as possible. And I have suggested some of the ways in which a body of work, the genre of portraiture and visual culture, might contribute to this goal by bringing such issues into sharp relief. Excuse me. So we are thinking, with the materials and ideas that I have touched on, to bear back upon ourselves because of the distinctive yet interconnected forms of witnessing that they involve. And so it only remains to me to thank you for the gift of my post, and I give special thanks for the support of family, friends and colleagues, all of which I do indeed experience as gifts of life and love. Thank you.